All right. Hi, Foot Nerds. It's Ruth O'Donnell, and I'm here with Kate Powell today. I'm very excited to talk to Kate. And before I'm going to introduce her, but before I do that, I wanted to I always think that like somebody stumbles across this and they don't even know who the Foot Nerds are. So just a little bit of background about who we are and what it's all about on this channel. So there's about 200 of us approximately all around the globe who have gone through a year-long program with the Foot Collective. That This program is no longer in existence. It was a year-long, essentially like a health journey that started with the feet. So for those of you that don't know, the Foot Collective is a health education company that focuses on foot health, restoring and maintaining and foot health in order for us to explore and live more freely, like in and more comfortably in our bodies. And then the Foot Nerds, who are really sort of a little subset of the Foot Collective, we don't have this education program in place anymore, but we still have these conversations because the Foot Nerds have been through a program um, that included six pillar health. So we start with the feet and movement, and and then it also includes sleep, food, mental health, environment, like essentially like whole body health. So we have always said that a foot health conversation is a whole body conversation. And I've sort of changed that to a foot health conversation is a whole human health conversation. And my personal background with feet is that I found the Foot Collective and the Foot Nerd program when I was trying to resolve an old injury that kept me from feeling really healthy and like I could move my body in a comfortable way. And it wasn't until I actually started really looking at the feet, and my background is in kinesiology. I used to teach anatomy and physiology to nursing students at the junior college level, and we never really focused on the feet in my background or in my schooling, or we never really spent hardly any time on the feet except for learning about the bones and the muscles and the ligaments and basic biomechanics of the feet, but never in depth. So once I took off my shoes and socks and put my feet on the ground, which I had never really done before, um, my health started to shift. And so that's like how I sort of came into this year-long program, and now it's just been a life sort of a journey. This is my fourth year in this journey, like sort of back to feeling really good and comfortable in my skin. Kate Powell has been a significant part of that because um, I realized that through old injuries, through knee surgery, through just life, like being on the planet for 56 years, uh, I, I overly compartmentalized the physical and the textbook notion of what was happening in my body. And it wasn't until, I mean, I've always dabbled in subtle body work. I'm a yoga teacher. I have studied cranial sacral therapy and Reiki. And so I've always been super intrigued about the mysteries of the human body and not just the textbook sort of physical machinery. And so one of the reasons why I stopped teaching anatomy and physiology is because the way that we approached our education about the human body was not integrated or like comprehensive enough. So I've been on a meandering journey studying the human body and human movement and like spirit and soul, which doesn't get brought into our conversation very often. So I have Kate Powell here, and I'm going to let her introduce herself, but I will say that like with her work as a subtle body expert and a nervous system expert, it wasn't until I like worked with the support of that I'm starting to have like significant resolution in like fear-based, like my nervous system was just always like kind of effed up with fear, even though like the tissue damage would resolve. So I'm starting to get some real benefits. And I guess I've been working with Kate on a pretty regular basis for a few months now. I don't even know when, but
think we would have started back in September, October. Yeah. I think
wow.
back in the fall. So I think,
Yeah. So it's been
yeah,
very
probably
helpful.
about October.
It's been such a helpful compliment. And I don't even want to say compliment. It's been like a significant, important and actually, I don't know, I'm not sure what the word is, but it's like necessary. It's been a
Mm.
necessary part of my healing journey.
Mm.
So, Kate, welcome.
Thank you.
And
Thanks, Ruth.
I can't wait to like dig into this conversation. So maybe we can just start by you introducing yourself and what your work is,
Mhm.
and how that. We'll just start there.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm Kate, Kate Powell, and yeah, my business is Wild Sacred Journey. So you can find me at www.wildsacredjourney.com. And I would say my work is really, it's funny. I mean, you were talking about people come for different reasons. Usually there's always some instigating spark, but that's like that for any kind of change people are seeking in their lives. Usually it takes us reaching some threshold of like, this can't continue as it is, which I mean, that's where I was in my journey when I, started, because yeah, that's what kind of gets us to move out of just the routines and the kind of almost the numbness that
Mhm,
we kind of fall into as we're just doing the same things we've kind of always done.
mhm,
And so usually there's some kind of upheaval in someone's life when they come find me, because that's, like I said, when we start to seek out change. But I would say it's funny because even though you were talking about resolving things on a physical level, and I'm aware that that's the conversation we're having on some level today, because that's the conversation of like the foot nerds, and most people are in this community because they're on a physical health journey. But when you get down to whether it's like someone lost a job or is about to start a new job, or is an empty nester now, or is starting to enter perimenopause, or is had some other like newly sort of more traumatic, whether big T or little t, experience happen, and realize that there's actually unresolved stuff from their other traumas that's now bubbling up, whatever the different reasons are. Ultimately, because humans are relational humans, most people, when they come, it's also about that something isn't working in their relationship, whether it's with themselves, with their body, with their significant other, or their family, or, whatever that is. So I would say, like, at its heart, my work is actually relational work,
mhm,
because it's about rewiring our patterns around how we relate.
mhm,
And I mean that in sort of what we consider to be a relational kind of way, how we relate to each other, how we relate to ourselves, but then also in the sense of like how our bodies move through the world. So I think it's also a relational, I mean, that's also a relational conversation, actually, because when we start getting into nervous system conversations, we start to look at how, yeah, we have our own personal nervous system, but our personal nervous system is always in relationship to responding to expressing itself within the context of what's happening around us.
mhm,
And then other people's nervous systems are picking up on what's happening in our nervous system, and they're having their own process. And then, sometimes we end up in some weird feedback loop with another person, or a certain situation. But then, too, because the work I do is also, you could use the word shamanic. I often use the word animistic more. So the idea that we live in a sentient universe, so that, this idea of human supremacy that we've been taught, that we are the be all end all of the species and the consciousnesses, right? Is like, in an animistic worldview, that's not true. And so, when you were talking about taking your shoes and socks off and actually putting your feet on the earth, and I had a little bit of a similar situation. For me, a big part of my health journey was I started farming, and it was like I was outside, I was moving my body, I was growing the food that then I was eating, that then I was sharing with my community, that then I was, you know, and that like really shifted my health process a lot. And so, and there are a lot of ways our modern world has taught us to think of the earth as a resource. And so we could look at it from this very simple way of like, oh, well, it's just because we're grounded, or it's just because, that we could kind of try and make that mundane. I can't even come up with an example because my brain's gotten so used to thinking of it as the sentience. But the idea is that the earth has a nervous system too, and like has a heartbeat too. And when we have our feet barefoot on the earth, or when our hands are touching the soil and touching the plants that are growing from the soil and touching the fruit of those plants and then putting it in our mouths and our bodies, consuming it, there's actually a deep co-regulation and exchange, a relationship that's happening there. So I would say, like, at its heart, my work is relational and then animistic, in the sense of bringing people back into relationship with sort of this loving sentience that's all around us. And I would say most people, and I think this is where it kind of bridges a little bit with the physical aspect of things too. I think most people, most of our symptoms, whether they're mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, relational, come from this sort of that we've been playing the wrong game, or we've been playing on the wrong for us terms, right? And we've somehow kind of gotten disconnected from whatever our unique spark of aliveness is. And so I think, and that's a piece too that's becoming clearer and clearer for me in the last, like, I would say 6 months, a year or so. Our long ago ancestors knew that and we see this in stories, and we see this in myths, and we see this in like ritual and ceremony, and sort of where some of those traditions are still intact. There are elders and wisdom keepers who will say this. So that's part of how I can know that many of our long ago ancestors knew this, but knew that being human is actually not inevitable. And being
Okay.
Yeah, well, we can unpack that more in a second. Yeah,
I was like, what? I think what?
I know. So being human is not inevitable. Being alive is not actually inevitable either. So just because we've been born and we're not dead yet does not actually mean we're alive.
Yes.
And same thing, it doesn't actually mean we're human either.
Okay, say more about that.
Yeah. So I think then we have to look at the question of, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be alive, right? And the same thing too, we get older, but becoming an elder is not inevitable just because our bodies get older, right? So what does it mean to be these things? And I think some of it's that we've lost by just kind of assuming those things are inevitable. We actually stop asking ourselves the questions. And that right there is a disconnect, right? So what is it to be human? And I think especially in the world right now, where there's AI, where our, daily schedules are increasingly like, sit still, sit in front of this computer, be hooked up to these machines, do these things. Like, we're living in a world that's increasingly disconnected from the natural cycles of the day, the solar cycles, the lunar cycles, the seasonal cycles, the like, how are things growing? How are our bodies responding to what's happening? I eat different types of foods depending on what season it is, because my body wants different types of foods depending on what the temperature is. My energy levels fluctuate depending on what season it is, and we're kind of in these 24-hour, we have these things broken down into this like 12-month calendar of 24-hour days. And we are actually getting disconnected from what it is to be human, because what it is to be human is to be a species, a part of a larger ecosystem and collective nervous system that's happening on like this planetary scale, and so to be a part of that, to me anyway, that's part of what it means to be human, and to be consciously engaged with the challenges and joys and mysteries and questions and the evolution of that, in my mind, is what it means to be human. And so there's so many ways we've set up our modern society that are actually increasingly disconnecting us from that very basic foundational, like, what is it to have a body that exists on this planet at this time? And by this time, I don't mean the Gregorian calendar time. I mean, like, yeah, within the context of this particular moment, which is a season and a day and a night and a, whatever.
Well,
So,
like
yeah.
double click on what you said about like we're increasingly like the disconnect is very confusing too, because like you're talking about like we are seated, we're in front of the computers, we're like still, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not using I mean our bodies are designed to move.
They are.
Um, and but at the same time, it's like what I notice is like with what I like to call car logic, which is like we don't respect like how primitive our bodies actually are. So you can have the
Mm-hmm.
car, you can go 1,000 different places in 1,000 different minutes of the day. Like,
Mm-hmm.
but if you don't have the car, um, your body does like three things in a day. And then
Yeah.
so it's like between the over frenetic production of like modern life because of the car and all of the ways that we can transport the human flesh around,
Yeah.
combined with the weirdness of like sitting still for long periods of time, like can I mean like that just I think we'll unpack that even more, but like I think that the body just gets really really confused about like what are we actually asking of it, right? So like we talk about first principles in our work, in our educational work, first principles being that the human body is a self-healing, self-organizing organism that responds to the inputs without like without any kind of it will respond to the inputs we give it regardless. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily have any reason to make choices. So like whatever
Mm-hmm.
inputs we give it, it will
Mm-hmm.
respond.
Same as animals, same as plants. I mean, what you're describing right there is just how any species is designed to exist in an environment,
Yes,
you know?
nervous system wise, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you give
Yep.
me inputs, I give outputs in the most simplistic sense.
Yep.
But before we go any further, Kate,
Yeah.
what is your like what would you say the title of who like what is your work? So I am
Yeah.
Ruth O'Donnell. I'm a kinesiologist and I work for the Foot Collective. Like, what is that for you?
Yeah. I really resist that question in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
partly because it's really hard to say. So, yes, I mean, I would say in some ways you could say subtle body and nervous system expert. In other ways, you could say shamanic practitioner. In other ways, you could say medicine woman or ceremonialist or trauma repair specialist or whatever. For me, what I'm shifting towards though is less, because I think all of those, and again, another thing that I think we do a lot is we get really caught up in these roles as identities rather than as roles, because again, we've lost some of that like village. I mean, I think that's some of what you were pointing to just now and what you were saying is that, we're operating on a scale because of kind of the technology that we've developed and how quickly information and our body can move from place to place. We're operating on a scale that our nervous systems have not evolved to catch up to yet. you know um and I think that's part of where that disorientation comes from. But so yeah, so I mean, I think you could give me any of those titles. I think really at the heart though, all my work, regardless of like what the role is, constellates around this idea of like, yeah, that being alive is not inevitable, but it's always inviting us back. And so those symptoms, the mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, relational symptoms that people are struggling from, I see them as an invitation, as points where friction's happening, that's showing that the world is like saying, you're alive, you're alive. And there's something in our life that isn't aligned with aliveness in that particular area. And there's an invitation back to that. So I would say bringing people from some sort of numbness or some sort of complacency or some sort of like scar tissue buildup, callus buildup, I mean, and I'm sort of talking more on a subtle level than the actual physical level in this moment, but as a metaphor, you know, back into aliveness. So a realivener.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're talking about language too, right? So like depending on who, like we talk about meeting people where they are in
Right.
whatever work we're
Yes.
doing. So like if you know that there's a way that you could talk about your work to somebody that would help them understand, like you don't, just like we change, I forget what it's called, but like where you change your register and your tone depending on like
Yep.
who you're speaking to based on like
Yep.
being in relationship, right? Like you don't,
Yeah.
I don't speak to, I speak a different way if I'm presenting public speaking to a large group as if
Hmm.
or if I were speaking to a child or to,
Right.
parent
Right.
or somebody, there's
Yeah.
change how we talk. But let's go take your work and everything you've discussed and then relate that to feet.
Yeah.
Like so feet, taking off our shoes and socks, like I mean, I guess I didn't, if you asked me 5 years ago, like why would I be working specifically with feet first? I wouldn't, I would never, I wouldn't believe that this would be the direction that my life has gone. And yet, um, I took off, I mean, like, I guess like as a child, we were more, we were freer. So I spent more time barefoot. As I started to like take on adulting roles, whether it was like, you don't go all the rules, right? You don't go shoeless in public. You don't, you wear your shoes, like put your shoes on, put your shoes and socks on. You're going to hurt yourself or whatever. So as I got older, I would always just have shoes on because that was what I was taught to do. But when Nick St. Louis and the team at TFC were, like really saying like, you, we have to work with the whole kinetic chain and it starts with the feet. And then I took my shoes and socks off and like, I really love Nick boils it down to something very, very simple. But I think then there's like all this other nuance, right? Because like the minute that I put my feet on the ground regularly, I mean, like you start to feel life in a different way. There's like something like it's what you're talking about. Like you start to like really acknowledge that there is some like there's like something. It just feels so much better to have the feet free and shoes off. That I've been 4 years where I think probably 80% of my days are spent like without anything on my feet. And I can't undo that. Like it's, I can't unscramble that omelet, like
Mm.
that is a done deal for me. So can you talk about your work and like how it relates to like the experience of somebody like as an adult, taking their shoes and socks off and then like, because it can be very emotional for
Hmm.
people to
Hmm.
do that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, well, I think some of that goes back a little bit to what I was saying about sort of the conditioning, right? Of like, we're playing the wrong game or we're playing the game on terms that aren't right for us, right? And so, why have we been told it's safer to have your shoes on? Well, because we have broken glass and, sharp objects everywhere, right? And but at some point that's kind of a false, like it's not like thorns and sharp rocks haven't been part of the environment for a long time. And when people went barefoot all the time, they had calluses built up on the bottoms of their feet that allowed them to move, so it's like our bodies, like you said, are adapting all the time. And if we're not using something, then our body starts to just kind of lose it because it's, our bodies are always in a state of evolution and they're evolving based on what we are asking of them, like what the environment is asking of them. And so the more we kind of create these environments that are safe, that are stationary, quote unquote safe, quote unquote stationary, all of that, the more we're actually losing the adaptive mechanisms that allowed us to engage with the world in this a little bit less sheltered, in this a little bit less like padded wall, kind of way. And what's interesting too, you were talking about kind of that disconnect, I think, in for people, like the confusion, the physical confusion in some ways of like, yeah, the body that can go to all these places and do so many more things in a day and this and that, but really we haven't adapted for that yet in a lot of ways. Like, our bodies are so much more primitive than that. And um, and I think, yeah, and so I think a piece of that is like our nervous systems, I find myself curious and sort of suspicious that perhaps part of the reason anxiety is like at an all-time high on like a collective species level right now is that part of how our nervous systems actually down regulate is we have to have this sense of inner trust. And the way our nervous systems work is they're constantly shifting back and forth between interoception, exteroception, proprioception, right? So this idea that we knowing what's happening internally, knowing what's happening externally, and knowing what's happening in the space between those, like how our body is in relationship to the space around us, right? And we're losing a lot of that because we're becoming either extremely exteriorly focused and mostly exteriorly focused on machines and things like that, not actually on other humans or other sentient species, whether it's trees, rocks, animals,
Along with pharmaceuticals and doctor's appointments, we haven't, like, that's one of the things
Yep.
we talk about in our work as foot nerds, is taking real radical responsibility for our well-being.
Yeah.
So
Right.
constantly exporting that to doctors and pharmaceuticals and sleep aids and,
Right.
all the things that help us, then we don't ever gain that sense of inner trust that you're talking about.
Right. Because too, then what we're doing is we're also losing the ability, I talk about how energy is actually just a language. So when we talk about the subtle body, we're actually talking about the energy. And that makes sense. Like we have, like our body is constant movement. It's cells, it's atoms, it's whatever, that's all moving. And all of that creates certain frequency, right? And that's the subtle body. It's the energetic blueprint, and there's people who believe too that that's actually how a liver cell knows it's a liver cell and not a heart cell, for example, is that the energetic field within and around our body holds the blueprints for how our cells know how to organize themselves. So if we're losing the language of energy, so we're losing the ability to sense what's happening inside. And then we're kind of misplacing where we're actually putting our trust as we're sensing things happening externally. And then we're also losing our body's ability to walk barefoot, to run, to jump, to balance, to hang and swing, right? Like all of these movements that our bodies evolved as survival mechanisms, as well as like pleasure practices, but it was so that they could hunt. Our ancestors could hunt. It was so that they could gather and forage. It was so they could get away from predators. It was so they could fight invading tribes and groups. It was so they could, it was so they could craft what they needed, the shelter and the food and the tools, right? So our bodies evolved movement to be able to do those things. And the more we're losing those, I believe, the more our nervous systems are actually feeling anxious because our nervous systems fundamentally feel untrusting that if a threat were to come at us, we would actually be able to respond. And so I personally am curious and somewhat suspicious of this massive rise of anxiety. And I think there's a lot of different pieces to why that's happening. But I'm wondering how much of that is just that our nervous systems, on some level, we no longer have trust in ourselves to be able to actually respond to a threat. And that's going to create that low level hypervigilance, constantly being on a lookout for a threat, constantly trying to protect and mitigate against things happening, which actually dampens our resilience and our sense of trust in ourselves, because then what we're doing is we're trying to erase threat from the environment rather than actually building up the skills to respond to challenges and threats when they come, because that's part of being alive, right? Is like being alive means threats are going to happen and challenges are going to happen and pain and heartbreak and loss, along with joy and love and all of these other things. Being alive is having access to the full spectrum.
I wanted to, I was just thinking about, like, as you're speaking about inner trust and resilience, I was going back to, like, so I've been on this journey of, like, what I originally thought was, I mean, was and is like, I want to play. Like like
Mm,
I'm super sensitive about like, I've always been a super kinesthetic, and I express myself so much through movement. And
mhm,
when I have these injuries, um, was when I found this like year-long program and I started to get better. So it was like 3.5 years in, I guess. So you're saying I started seeing you last September or October, and I'm just going back there because I want to illustrate an example of what you're talking about.
mhm,
I'm remembering now because I had had two really bad falls, even though
mm,
I had been practicing. Well, for the record, like I took off my shoes and socks, I got into natural footwear, I was following on, getting
mhm,
like out, just moving and trying to like build capacity in my body so that like I could trust myself more.
mhm,
And it did help a lot. I got to a point where like I was doing more playing tennis, but I still had like this anxiety that you're talking about, like a nerd, like I couldn't manage it. And it was just like, it was, nothing was making sense. Like, how am I
mhm,
practicing every day, doing the things that I want to be doing? And I'm still, number one, in physical pain.
mhm,
Right? So we'll talk about that later, like how your body remembers, even if you're like
mhm,
doing
mhm,
practices, your body has like these stored, what I
mhm,
call like in cranial sacral therapy, I think they call them like energy cysts. Like your body
mhm,
remembers, if you fall down and you're not in a super relaxed state, you or you don't have a way or a tool to like get that out of your body, it kind of just remembers.
mhm,
So I had this really bad fall on my scooter, and I just was like having these crazy falls, and I was like, something is not fucking right. So that's
mhm,
when I think I reached out to you at that point, where I was like, I need support that's beyond this whole package that's amazing, but it is about some sort of low level anxiety slash depression around like not being able to like trust my body. And
mhm,
so, I mean, it was like, so all that is to say is like now, however many months later we've been working together, like I am starting to build that. Like I
mm,
feel like, oh, like I'm starting to feel more like,
mhm.
like
Yeah.
it's like exciting because
Yeah.
I like, you have something inside you as an adult, and for younger people that maybe they're like more bouncy and rubbery still,
Mhm,
like they're
mhm, mhm,
or like I just as an athlete, like kind of just really didn't take super good care of my body, pushed through a lot of like, I've talked about this a lot in our conversations on podcasts, like our coaches were just like, you run through
mhm,
pain, you get punished with running
mhm,
because you
mhm.
didn't make the shot or whatever. And so just so much like stored angst. But
Yeah.
the minute that we started to work on the nervous system relationship, I guess, I mean, I'm still kind of like naive about all this, but like I do feel better because we're
Mhm,
addressing what you're
mhm.
talking about. And so there's like a little more balance in my system where it's like, oh, the body feels safe. I can, I can go
Yeah.
out in the world. I have a new level of resilience that I didn't have 6 or 7 months ago. And so I
Yeah.
think that this conversation is so important because I see people not getting better in my work,
Mhm.
even though they're practicing, and it's very frustrating for them.
Yeah. So I think some of what you're kind of pointing to here kind of brings us back a little bit to what you were talking about, the emotionality for people that sometimes comes up when they take their shoes and socks off and actually bring their feet to the earth. And that, yeah, sometimes there is this upwelling of emotion. And so it also kind of ties to what I was just saying about how, the our energetic body is actually the blueprint for our cells. So, and then what you were saying about the storage. So I'm kind of tying those three threads together right now in some ways, maybe some other threads to do. But so, as you said, our body stores stuff. So trauma is a word that's being used so much these days, but in its most simple form, trauma is something that at the time it happened, we weren't able to process through, because stuff, like I said, challenge happens, risk happens, betrayal, loss, grief, death, all of that happens. That's part of life. So it's not about healing to a point where nothing bad ever happens. but it's about whether or not we're storing it in our bodies because we don't know how to process it, or we don't have the witnessing, the compassionate witnessing that we need to help us process it, right? If you watch an animal, something happens to them and then they kind of shake it off, more or less. Although a lot of domesticated animals are more and more acting like humans and may not be shaking it off as quickly. We're bleeding over onto them. But in general, it's about whether or not we had the tools at the time to process it through. So, an example, I saw a woman one time who she'd been in a car accident. She'd been driving, somebody had run a stop sign, or I don't know what, just hadn't braked and it hit her, kind of T-boned her car. Wasn't traveling at crazy speeds, so everybody was more or less okay. But what happened in that moment was she jumped right out of the car and they went right to like, okay, we got to call the police. We got to call the insurance companies. Is everybody okay? Went right to like, we got to handle it. Right. And so then she came to see me and she was like, I don't know why, like it's been weeks, the whiplash isn't healing. And I could see we have different layers of our energy fields. And the etheric layer, the one closest to her body, was literally offset from her actual physical body still. And so I could tell what side she'd been hit from because I could see where it had thrown her etheric body further to one side because she'd been hit from the other, And so we just brought that back into alignment. And then within a couple of days, the whiplash was gone. But the reason it hadn't come back on its own, because you're right, the body is incredible at healing itself. But there was an emotional and fear-based component to the issue, to the event, that she hadn't actually been able to process through, that hadn't received the witnessing and been allowed to just do what it needed to do.
Yeah,
If she'd like given herself later, if she'd gone home and been like, okay, now I'm going to sit down and cry and like let my body move through whatever that was, then it probably would have come back on its own. Sometimes we still need some support, because sometimes too, what can happen, we need to feel the safety or the witnessing from somebody else when we're crying. We need to feel like we're seen or we're heard in the crying. Or sometimes what can happen too is if that trauma event is similar in resonance to another trauma event, it can activate like a tuning fork. It will start to activate an older trauma event. So that's part of why I think some of the emotion can come up for people when they there's different layers to the stuff that comes up, right? There's what happened to us personally. There's what happened to us personally that we're conscious of. There's what's happened to us personally that we're not conscious of, either because it was pre-verbal or happened in utero. There's what's happened to our ancestors. There's also the level of energy, time and space aren't linear. So like past life or like simultaneous life stuff, you can start to get into that world. And it doesn't make sense to our logical minds, but it comes up in sessions. So, there's something there. And then there's also, again, we have a collective nervous system. So there's also like what comes up collectively. So there's these different layers that get activated in a quote unquote trauma event. And so sometimes, often it's like we might tend to one of the layers. Oh, we'll tend to the physical. Oh, we'll tend to the this. Well, this must have been what happened to me this one time. And it's like, right, but what about that time actually that your grandmother got hit while she was pregnant and she didn't process that through? And so that actually got passed down through the DNA and through the subtle body into the physical body. So now there's this extra charge of fear that you're like, well, that doesn't seem quite so, like that seems disproportionate to my personal experience. And that's when we can start to think, oh, maybe there's something else going on here.
yeah,
There might be some other layers that are also getting activated at the same time. So like, for example, when people take their shoes and socks off and bring their feet to the earth, there's your personal grief actually around probably all the ways you got stopped playing, because how many kids like kind of get told to stop playing before they're really ready to stop playing, and had to kind of quote unquote grow up too quickly, right? So there might be some of that grief. There's then the collective grief of like us as a species being disconnected from the great mother, which is the earth, feeding us, taking care of us, nervous system attuning us, co-regulating us, right? There's, there's then whatever physical imbalances we might have developed in response to our movement patterns that have been shoe and sock based, that have been, like you were describing, like push, push, push based, So when we start to unwind one piece of that, it's like all those other threads are also there.
Yeah.
And then we're standing there and they're like, all I did was take my shoes and socks off.
Yeah.
Why am I crying? And it's like, oh, because there's a lot that's there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did that kind of answer the question? I feel like I sort of started
No,
drawing these threads together and then kind of got,
no, it did answer the question though.
yeah.
It did answer the question, and in regards to the woman who, like, you talked about the woman who got hit, and
Mm-hmm.
then just like the idea that our bodies are self-healing, but
Mm-hmm.
we're not, but we also have become so like you were saying that had we still had the capacity of allowing our bodies to like maybe shake, like that shaking response that happens like and when you get hit
Mm-hmm.
or something, like where you tremble, right? That's that
Right.
like body processing that, and we
It
don't
is.
interrupt that.
We do. Our mind is like, oh no, we're okay. And it
Yeah, like
tries
my
to
mind.
override our body's
Yeah,
impulse to just
yeah, so we override
heal.
those impulses that would be like that animal response that you're talking about. So we override the trembling, the shaking, which is like ducks ruffling their
Mm-hmm.
feathers.
Mm-hmm.
We override the crying, and then on top of that, like you, one thing that you said that I think struck for me personally is that like if you don't, if you go home and it's like we're like nuclear families, like we're not like, not
Mm-hmm.
everybody, like you don't have somebody to hold you necessarily. And like
Mm-hmm.
I remember
Mm-hmm.
when I was in college and I we lived around like with friends and family nearby, and I did get into a car accident and I went home, and immediately my friend was like, are you okay? And then like came over and I was like, and then you just unload there.
Right.
But we don't
Yeah.
actually have that
Yeah.
much anymore, that was like built in community support, family, friends that are actually available, right? Because everybody's doing 1,000 things in their cars, running to different places. So by the time you actually tend to those, that process, it's already kind of, you've already like numbed it out a little bit. So
Yep.
then we do need support, I guess is my point.
And
Like besides
yeah.
just not having the bodily like old school ways that we, our bodies would just naturally take care of that business, then also like we're out of like touch with like our friends and families and neighbors and communities, where
Yeah.
you don't necessarily get that right away in order to kind of process those little things that could not be stored in our bodies, you know?
Right. And so this is where too, I think this is part of what's coming back to this idea of like being alive isn't inevitable. We actually have to have the relationships and the rituals and the processes that help us move through, because then when we don't move something like that through and our nervous system then stays stuck in this survival pattern, this adaptive pattern that ultimately in the long run doesn't allow for the harmony, the flow, the actual health of the system, the optimal harmony and optimal flow and health of the system, you know, when that gets stuck, that's when we start to create these fragmentations, this energetic buildup that then gets in the way of our actual aliveness. And so, I think part of what you're pointing to there is like the healing process is part of being alive, actually. But that again, because it's not inevitable, because we are actually we're adapting ourselves more and more to interrupting the process of aliveness, which
Yes.
means we're adapting ourselves more and more to interrupting our body's own ability to heal itself.
Yes.
And we're losing, and this also ties back into why I was sort of saying that I think this work is really ultimately, a wasp just flew through. We're saying some really sharp truths here. But yeah, so part of why I think too it feels like this work is relational is because that co-regulation, that witnessing, that somebody else holding the safe presence so that we can come undone fully enough that our system can reset itself. Like that's a necessary part of the aliveness, of the health, of the wellness, And so the more we get isolated, the more we're too busy. And this too is like the tuning fork thing, right? Like part of the reason too, so few people in our lives are able to actually hold us is because their bodies also have frozen stuff in them that hasn't been processed through. And so they can't hold us in that space, because if we start crying, they're going to, the parts of them that need to cry is going to want to start crying. And so it's easier for them to just keep rushing, 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 and kind of throw some platitudes at us and not actually be there for us, because they just don't have the time to come, they're interrupting their own needs too. And so we end up stuck in this like feedback loop
Yeah.
of adaptive what's become maladaptive resonance rather than, and so that's part of why we need the people who spend, it's funny. I mean, yes, I work with clients, but my actual work is making sure my nervous system is in a state where when people come to me, I can hold the resonance that's going to let their bodies and their systems reorganize themselves out of the maladaptive and back to the harmonious, whatever their harmonious is. And so,
So
like,
good.
that's actually my work. My work is actually to keep myself in the right space for that to happen. And so that's part of why it's also different coming to someone, a professional, for something like that than just venting to a friend, or, and not that there isn't value in that. There can be, but often that ends up becoming sort of more trauma bonding and more feedback looping, more maladaptive resonance activating, rather than I'm holding this frequency and now your system can actually drop down and match the frequency I'm holding, and it can actually down regulate and it can actually reorganize.
So you're saying you're just on fire in certain, I mean, because like a couple things. So first of all, like we talk about in our work as foot nerds, like if in the best possible case scenario, your body remembers, you allow for your body to remember what it's designed to do. So
Hmm.
illustratively, you get in a little car fender bender, you let yourself shake and cry and process it through. You go home and you're still affected, and you have a built-in network of people who are also like their nervous systems are intact, and they can hold you, like literally hold you, right? We don't even talk
Mm-hmm.
about that anymore. Like, come here,
Mm-hmm.
baby, what happened?
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't
Mm-hmm.
talk tenderly to each other in that way because like we're all effed up. But and then you get a little extra, and then let's say still not resolved, but your nervous system, your body, you're taking responsibility for your health, you're letting your body self heal, self organize, and then you might need support. So then that's where the professional comes in, right? Like the whole point of when we became foot nerds, most of us who were like attracted to this sort of like idea of education was that we lead by example, we take responsibility for our health, and we don't export our health. That doesn't mean that we don't need support. So
Yeah.
you have like a few ingredients that we need to work with, right? Like you were saying something to me the other day, like you love doing your work because like it's who you are and it's your work, but it's also when I applied to the Foot Nerd program, we had to do these like video applications, right? And I remembered that I said in my application, like, I'm in my whatever I was 4 years ago, like, I'm in my 50s. And I want to, like, be able to I want to help other people in my age group, like, have some freedom of movement in their lives. So I don't always have to be playing with the 20-year-olds. Do you know what
Mm-hmm.
I mean? Like, and you were saying, like, I do this work too because I want to have other, like, regulated humans around me whose nervous systems are intact so I can have some freaking friends to play with.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like helpful to everybody.
Yeah.
And I think the education is really important. And I think the education is important without apologizing, right? Like I really am very hell bent on not ever saying like this might sound woo woo, or I don't even know where that word came from, but it's like no, this is what it means to be a human with a nervous
Yeah.
system. And
Yeah.
I love what you're talking about, like feeling alive, because 7 months ago I was like I don't honestly know like where my life is going. Like I was feeling not alive. And
Mm-hmm.
for somebody who is like so kinesthetically expressive,
Mm-hmm.
I was like, some shit's got to change because I feel like I'm dying inside.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess where I'd like to go next is just to hear about your own health journey, like your background, because I know you have like a background in movement as well, and just like
Mm-hmm.
your own relationship to your feet and the ground. And I know you have a very deep relationship with land. In French they say terroir, or
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
actual. It's more than just land, right? So
Right.
talk a
Yeah.
little bit about your own health and your own journey and your feet.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. I want to say quickly too, I think because this was a thread that was kind of coming through at one point, when we were talking about the feet on the earth and why feet seem like they matter so much in this conversation too, about kind of aliveness and relationship, is that so many of our senses are actually, unless we're sort of consciously engaging with them in a different way, seem to show us our separateness from the rest of the world and from each other. So it's like the things that happen outside of us, right? So it's like when we see things, we're seeing objects as separate. When we hear things, we're hearing sounds coming to us from somewhere else. When we, taste maybe is a little bit different because it kind of, and smell, because they kind of take it in. But there's something about, but still they're coming to us from somewhere else. And there's something about touch, whether it's feet on the ground or hands on the ground, or like you were talking about holding people, that reminds us that we're not as separate as our minds would have us believe. And I think that's also part of why foot conversations around feet are conversations around whole humanness, Um, so yeah, that kind of a brief segue. But yeah, so then within my own journey, I would say I was always really sensitive and attuned to other people around me and their emotions. And I did not have people in my life who knew how to help me hold that. I was also always a mover. I was always climbing trees because I wanted to see how the world might look to birds. I mean, it was like I was one of those kids. Like, probably would be diagnosed as neurodivergent if I choose to put a label on it, and like get those tests done and all of that. I was like the quirky kid who wanted to be outside and see how the birds like saw the world. And, um, I
This
thought I
is
was
the
a horse for a
I mean, like,
couple years.
I'm sorry, but like that just sounds like a child though.
I
Like
know.
that's just I mean, yeah, I
I
guess.
agree. That's part of why I don't really believe in diagnoses,
Yeah.
because again, I think there's a lot of things that we're diagnosing as atypical because the systems and structures of the world that we've set up are actually so anti-human. And then we try to put people in them, and then they struggle to exist in those systems. And then we're like, oh, well, it must be because you're this or you're this, and then we create some label or some category, which isn't to say that some of those things aren't true, or it isn't valuable to explore some of those because it might help explain some things about you. For me personally, sometimes some of those diagnoses help me sort of see where, oh yeah, I'm not designed to fit into this as the world wants me to fit into it, kind of, or as society wants me to fit into it. So it kind of helps me push back a little bit sometimes against those ideas of quote unquote what's normal, and to just affirm myself of like, you don't actually have to try to fit into that. That's just, let's stop trying. But yeah, I think, I don't believe in diagnoses for diagnoses sakes. But anyway, because yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of that's just a kid. Kids want to explore the environment and they want to touch it and they want to engage with it and they want to move through it. And that, again, they're alive until the world gets its hands on them. And again, by the world, I don't mean the actual world, I mean our society world.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, I think I was, yeah, pretty typical in a lot of ways in that sense, but I was always very attuned to other people's emotions and nervous systems. I think I was just innately sensitive to that kind of stuff and had a lot of different sensory things happening. Um I was so sensitive. My family called me the princess and the pea because I had a period where I would freak out because I could feel the seams in my socks and they bothered my feet. Here's a foot conversation. Yeah, I would have like a meltdown every day trying to get ready for school because I would just like throw a fit because I could feel the seams in my socks and it all felt wrong. And my mom was like in tears because she was like, if they made seamless socks, I would buy them for you, but they don't make seamless socks, you know? But what if we lived in a world where I could have just gone barefoot? I mean, I think some part of me was really rebelling against socks and shoes. Like I hadn't put that together until now, but I mean, I think that's some of what that was like the sense, it was just sensory wise, it felt totally wrong to me. So anyway, but I also was like anybody, I was a relational being. And so I wanted to fit in and I wanted to belong and I wanted to so I kind of like learned to play the game. And then fast forward, yeah, by the time I was in college, I was really depressed. I had a lot of weight gain, and different periods of my life where I'd had a lot of weight gain, which always led to lots of foot problems and pain and other joint pain as well. I tend to be more hypermobile um, than otherwise. So, um, yeah, and I was just, yeah, so I was really depressed, really disconnected from my body, really in my head, um, and was having, yeah, just a lot of physical and particularly foot and plantar fasciitis pain. And um, and so after I graduated college, I found yoga, specifically power vinyasa yoga, which I think I needed something that was more active at the time because I like could not sit still to save my life. I would just start to like panic if anybody tried to get me to sit still. Because it was like too much alone with my thoughts. Um, and so then through like sort of that more active physical movement, but one that was still subtle body informed. So it was still about starting to move some of that energy through. And I mean, I would sometimes cry for like the entire 90-minute class. Like anytime my head was below my heart, it would just tears. So I started working a lot through then. Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth, like a lot of those. So these kind of helped me start to sort of separate out, like, I am not my thoughts. That was like a big step for me in the journey. And then also giving me a bigger container to hold the emotions in so that I could kind of witness them a little bit without being so consumed by them. But I found that even with all of that, even though I quote unquote knew better, I was still finding myself in same patterns in my life. And so I just kind of stumbled into this 3-year long integrative energetic medicine and coaching program, which was more of that animistic sort of indigenous wisdom tradition. You could call it shamanic if you want to, kind of training that was, yeah, that really started working with the subtle body. And then from there, really starting to shift then these patterns on that energetic blueprint layer, which led to, yeah, just more balanced, um, just more balanced health in general, I think. Um, I forgot to mention too the farming. Yeah, when I was working on the chemical-free vegetable farms, that was another big part. So that was kind of between yoga and the energetic training. And
So
so again,
yoga.
there was a lot of weight loss at that time, which again, I think happened because I was eating more in tune with the seasons, living more outside. So there wasn't as much climate control that was disconnecting my body so that I was eating heavier foods like in the summer when my body doesn't want the heavier foods, like all of that kind of stuff. So that kind of reorganized a lot of that. And just kind of gave me a sense of like purpose and satisfaction and fulfillment that a lot of the like just mental endeavors didn't.
Mhm. And
Um,
I mean, I guess like just to comment on the yoga, it seems to me that I notice a lot of people who, well, you just get barefoot.
yep,
So when you take up a yoga practice, there's so much in there because you are barefoot on a yoga mat. And so
yep.
it's a very acceptable place to like just
Start the
start,
barefoot move.
start
Hmm.
working on your, I mean, like we don't even know we're working on our feet. You go to yoga class, you take off your shoes and socks, you get on the mat. So
Hmm.
between that and the farming, like your hands in the dirt, your feet on the ground, and then
Yep.
and then finding like work that is really truly something that is matched with like who you are as a human.
Yeah. Well, and I would say too, with the energetic training too, I mean, again, that also brought me into learning that language of energy, which allowed me to then start to understand more what was happening inside, what was happening outside, like what was actually happening, rather than kind of this misattunement that I think a lot of us are moving through the world with, because we don't actually understand what's happening. And so we're doing a lot of meaning making that's disconnected from the actual nervous system, subtle body, physical reality of our internal experience and how it's relating to the external experience.
Yeah.
And so that's when we kind of start feeling like we're totally caught up in these like same mental loops that are often toxic, maybe not even true, you know, and it's like we can't get out of those, and we have no like reality check kind of happening in those moments, which then further increases our sense of isolation, our sense of disconnection, our sense of like confusion and destabilization and dislocation, you know, all of which then lead to more injuries, right? Because if we're not connected with our bodies, we're more likely to injure it, you know, more relational injuries because we like literally can't connect with other humans because the only thing we're so in our story of what's happening, which may or may not have any basis in reality, and then we have nothing to check it against, you know? And so then it's like, yeah, we become disconnected from people. We become increasingly disconnected from our body. And the more we're in that confused, dislocated, destabilized state, the more likely we are to just have all kinds of injuries on all the layers of our existence, you know?
Like I can't help but to say, like, this web that you're talking about, like, since we started working together in September, like, it's all feeling more. I mean, I don't want to say, it's like, it's just, I feel more human. Like, my relationship with my spouse is stronger. My relationship with my peers are stronger. My work is becoming more interesting. I have a different level of energy. My community relationships are growing. I, and all that is to say is that, like, I just feel like I want to. I just
Mhm.
want to be in the world doing these human things. And I think it's because of, like, just a, like a constant, like, learning. I mean, you're teaching me a missing link that I didn't have before.
Mhm.
Like, I had the
Mhm.
puzzle pieces that seemed like they were all together, but now it's like I have this new tool,
Mhm.
that is really important in this work that we're doing
Yeah.
as foot nerds. I think that, and I mean, I only speak for myself, because maybe other people have, what my friend Liz has calls, like, maybe other people have their poop in a group. But I, I mean, I'm learning, and it's helping me so much. So
Mm.
I just want to thank you, but I
Yeah.
also, I don't want to end yet, because I do want to talk to you
Yeah.
about. I wanted to, like, then switch to this other topic of, like, working with people, like, in what two groups, right? We talked
Yep.
about. So
Yep.
I would love to just unpack a little bit about, I don't know how to describe what you would say, but just your, insights on working with people with acute pain, um, maybe chronic pain from
Mhm.
repetitive injuries, or just, like, having to deal with that injury for a long time, and the nervous
Yeah.
system is just like in a loop. And then the difference between, like, working with that, and then, like, how, and then, like, this type of work too for people who are elite performers.
Mhm.
Like, what want to just say really quick, like, I think, like, you've said a lot over the last 60 minutes about how this type of work, between, like, how we take off our shoes and socks, eliminate, some of the, chair sitting in our lives, moving, developing, like, moving practices that are more joyful and more human, and kind of, like, honor the fact that we are kind of primitive bodies, like, that need
Mhm.
that kind of, like, jousting and playing, that, are based in joy and survival.
Mm.
But, like, one thing that is not talked about, and I know that it happens, like Novak Djokovic is, like, one of, he's obviously, like, one of the greatest athletes. I love tennis, of course. So he's like this elite athlete, and they don't. when they talk about like the practices that he uses, well, first of all, I think he has all sorts of like energy, medicine and
Mhm.
nervous system people that he works with, but I don't, I get the impression, this is my own story, that he doesn't necessarily feel all that comfortable talking about in depth what he uses.
Mhm.
Um, but I know that like elite athlete and elite performers who are trying to like get to the highest level of their craft use all of the modalities at their fingertips to help them, you know?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so I guess like just talking about, which I guess we have been talking about for 60 minutes, how we would use this for people who have acute pain, acute injuries, chronic pain,
Mhm.
are dealing with
Mhm.
like getting better and maintaining health over a longevity of a life. But
Yeah.
like also elite performers, people who are not in pain, people who are high functioning, if you will, who don't wake up every day. Like my sister has no joint pain whatsoever, and I'm like, what the hell? How? But at the same time, like I wouldn't say she's uh, regulated.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So can
Yeah.
you speak to like these groups and like how this, what just your insights
Mm.
about this?
Mhm. Yeah. So, I mean, like we sort of started at the beginning, I think, often it is some sort of pain that drives us to seek something. That's usually the instigating spark. Um,
Pain or curiosity are is what like Nick talks about.
mhm.
Like, people come to this work pain or curiosity, but I
Yeah.
see that curiosity is super
Yeah.
super. I mean, of the two, it's more pain than curiosity. It seems to me.
Yeah. Well, again, I think we're so oversaturated, moving in a million different directions. Most people feel like they're living on some sort of a relatively tight budget, right? And are having to kind of prioritize where they spend, time, energy, money. Those are our three most finite resources as individuals, right? And so most people are having to make choices about how and where they spend that. And I think there's a lot in our society that is very focused on the negative, right? And very negatively incentivized and kind of trauma bonded. You know,
Can
there's a
you
lot.
define what that means? Trauma bonded.
Yeah. So, something that happens a lot when people start coming to me is they come up against this fear of actually feeling better. And at the heart of it, often it's like, well, I think many of us carry some flavor of a fear that if we feel better, the people in our lives won't need to show up for us, won't need to take care of us. We'll end up being alone. They might even be mad at us for feeling better because they don't feel well. Like, how many of us, when we start to feel better, actually get negative pushback from people in our lives, you know? And and again, I think some of that points to that we don't have community that shows up for us unless we're struggling, particularly here in the US. I think that's an issue. Like, when a natural disaster happens, people pull together and they are generous. Like, we Americans are very good at heroic acts of generosity. We are terrible at chronic compassion,
Interesting.
actually, like as a society,
Yeah.
And some of that's that we've bought into a lot of myths of the hero and this like individual and the pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And like there's a lot of cultural reasons as to why I think that's probably true. But so I think that we're actually afraid to feel better, is some of what's happening. We're also afraid of the actual level of responsibility, you know, because we haven't had elders and we haven't had people helping. We don't have the rites of passage and the actual relational aliveness practices that help us move through those. Many of us have some stunted younger version of us that kind of comes to the forefront when things get challenging. And that part of us is afraid of taking responsibility for ourselves because
Yeah,
it's younger and
I
it
can
doesn't want
speak
to.
from experience on
I
that.
mean, I'm speaking from experience too, so don't get me
Not
wrong.
even, I did not recognize that, but I do now.
Yeah. And so, you know, and of course, because that poor younger part of us had to take responsibility for us at a much younger age than it should have. And so now as an adult that we're needing to take some different levels of responsibility for our own health, for our own wellness, that younger part of us is feeling burnt out on having to take responsibility and it just panics, right? So I think that comes up a lot. So I'm kind of listing some of the reasons that people actually often don't seek help or that people wait until it's so bad that they have no other option. But the struggle with that is that by the time we've waited to that point, the journey back to wellness takes a lot longer, which means a lot more of our time, energy, and money. So it feels more daunting. And often by the times when the potential for something is in our energy field, it's still potential energy. By the time it's actually become a physical symptom, and particularly a chronic physical symptom, then it becomes a lot harder to shift, actually. Which doesn't mean it's impossible. And it doesn't mean we can't shift our relationship to our body and what's happening with it, you know, and I don't mean this in any kind of like, oh, if you're in pain now, or if you have chronic pain, it's because you put things off too long and it's all your fault. Like, I'm not saying it is self-blame. I'm not encouraging navel gazing here. Like, you know, oh, we need to just like overanalyze every aspect of our existence. But it's more that, you know, we as humans are here to evolve something, right? Like love, divinity, divine presence, whatever we want to call it, right? Like, or even if you just want to think about it on a scientific level, like why is life here on the planet? So far, it seems like it's here to relate to itself and each other and evolve, right? So, you know, it helps often to think about the things that are happening in our lives as not happening to us, but happening for us. And so then it's like when we have these pains, when we have whether acute or chronic or, you know, physical, mental, emotional, whatever it is, it's good to, yes, tend to it on the layer that it's happening on, but then also kind of zoom out a little bit, bigger picture. What is this maybe have to teach me? What does this have to show me? And, you know, not, again, like I said, not in this navel gazing, not in this self-blame, you know, and not in this ableist sense of like pain is bad or wrong, but just in this sense of like, um, yeah, just in this sense of, you know, we're meaning making creatures, we're storytelling creatures. And so if we can tell ourselves a story about what's happening to us that feels more regenerative or hopeful or full of some sort of wisdom or possibility, then we can create a different relationship with what's happening in our bodies and with the world, you know? Um, so yeah, so I mean, I think so I feel like that's where my work meets people who are like in pain, is kind of in that, like, how do we start to zoom out and maybe figure out what this might be trying to teach us or show us about some of these other imbalances. And sometimes that means we can actually shift it, and something that seems miraculous from like a very Western medicine, physical only perspective, you know, might come into play. Sometimes we can't shift it, you know, and it's just part of our physical reality, but through that we can shift our relationship to it, you know. But I will say that, yeah, that and I think this though is where we then start bridging towards wellness for people who aren't experiencing physical pain, which is that we don't have to wait until, like, there's a whole spectrum between acute pain and like actual vitality and aliveness. Right? And we're so used to, because we are used to living in a medicine system that is not actually a wellness system. we we wait until things are painful because we think that's when something's going wrong, quote unquote. And specifically with physical pain, we tend to just kind of, I mean, I think we're getting better at it as a society at acknowledging the mental and emotional pain. But I mean, I would say that's really only within the last 10 to 20 years that's even shifting and that there's more conversation happening around that. You know, in the past, it was just the suffer in silence. And so I think when you're starting to talk about sort of, yeah, elite athletes, high performers, you know, the people who are really at the top of their game, they've gotten that, you know, and again, I think there can be a fear. I've seen that too with people. Sometimes it's more with artists, I think for me than athletes that I've seen it, but I would imagine it's similar where because we're so trained that the pain is where the gold comes from, right? Like whether that's in like the suffering artist archetype or whether that's in the athlete, like you were talking about, like the high school sports of like run through the pain, do the this, like, you know, no pain, no gain. Like, you know,
Yeah, it's like
it's like we think
you have to
anger and
suffer to get to
pain,
the top. You have to like pay,
right,
you have to pay your physical dues to get to the top.
right. And like, yes, you need devotion and you need discipline and you need to be able to like work hard, but
Dedication.
right. And sometimes it's gonna ask you to dig really deep, you know, and it's gonna ask you to go places that are uncomfortable. But so, you know, so is healing work, right? Like same thing happens there. Sometimes it asks you to go places that are uncomfortable and that you'd rather run from. So there's a very similar set of skills to help people kind of move actually, I think, into this, which is like to not be afraid of discomfort, to not be afraid of the discipline it's going to take, the sense of self-responsibility it's going to take, but to not be afraid of that, a on all the levels, but also to be motivated by something that's higher level than just not this, right? Like it feels like some of what I think we're pointing to with elite athletes and high performers is they're motivated by what they want, not by what they don't want. And
Right.
I think that's some of this conversation about wellness versus like the medical system that's sort of actually focused on imbalance and sickness, which is that like that's a response to what we don't want. I don't want to feel pain anymore.
Right.
Okay, great. Let's see what we can do about that. Meantime, what do you want to feel?
That's
And
right. And
that's, I think, actually the more important question because oftentimes healing and wellness, you have to kind of go through that dark night of the soul. You have to go through the parts that are uncomfortable first. And so when I see people kind of quitting before they actually get somewhere, is because they're fixated on the I don't want to feel pain anymore,
mhm.
rather than on the I want to feel joy. I want to feel vitality. I want to be able to move my body, you know. Those then allow for more fun, you know, they allow for more truth in some ways, actually, of like what actually matters. It's going to be easier to stay committed to them, usually, because it's what you want, not what you don't want, you know. I
So
don't
there's,
know. Yeah.
I was just going to tie like, it's just so, I think it's just so how you perfectly said about like how those two, like the two elite performers and the getting out of pain are like parallel. But I noticed that like we could take, so just to bring this back to like foot nerdiness and
Yeah.
like one of the things that we actually talk about is like when you embark on like let's say restoring, moving from a place of like pain or injury or just getting better, or you just don't, or you are curious, either pain or curiosity has led you to working on the health of your feet from the ground up and your whole body as a result, and then you can explore it and move in the world more freely. We can take what you were saying about like how like the elite performers are very very clear about what they want, right? So
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that we do in like the foot nerd program is we would have a log, essentially a journal if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So you would take a note and you would have what we would call proof of work or proof of
Yeah.
play, so that
Yeah.
you showed up. But before any of that happens, there has to be clarity about why you're doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that this is a blind spot for many of us. For me, it just so happened that Matthew, brought rollerblades and tennis rackets home. And then like I fell madly in love with tennis because I got so much other, besides just playing and competing, I got so much out of it
Mm,
that you're talking about, like community, like a drive. So I'm very clear that I want to feel good so I can continue to play in this tennis
mm,
community.
mhm,
But if I didn't have tennis, it would be very hard for me to continue to clarify why. Like
mm,
why do I want to spend 30 minutes every day on my foot health, rolling
mm,
out my feet, getting on my equipment, but I'm so clear about the why. And so I
mhm.
guess my bringing that back, like we can be like our elite performers in our own lives, right? So
Yeah.
that's one of
Yeah.
the things that I notice is shifting. Like if you saw me on the tennis court, Kate, you'd be like, she's not that good.
Well,
But
given that I'm sure I'm worse than you, I'd probably be like, oh my gosh, look at her. She's amazing. See, it's
no,
all
but like, and
relative.
I'm not even saying that like, like I'm a mediocre recreational athlete, but inside my body, like I have the feeling more so than I ever have of like I am elite in my own life because I have
Mm,
kind of put the puzzle pieces together and I feel alive again. Like I
yeah.
feel some life coming back to like every cell in my body. I'm like, oh my God, this is what I'm hoping for.
Hmm.
This is what I've been wishing for. So
Yeah.
I
I
guess
think,
we're, yeah.
yeah, I think that's some of what just, I know we're trying to wrap here. So yeah, but I think just to kind of bring it full circle, I think that's some of what I mean when I speak about like helping people find their unique spark of aliveness. Because I think it's about how do you, in the terminology of athleticism, like how do you become that elite performer? For me, it's like I just feel so much more powerful. And I don't like to use that word a lot because I think we kind of have this, yeah, we have this misunderstanding of what power actually is because we're so used to power dynamics that are power over, power under, dominance, oppression based, instead of like actually relational. Um, and compassionate, but yeah, I just feel so much more intact, contained, and like not in a like, in a
Protective.
yeah, or just like a somebody's bound me up kind of way, but like contained in like I've got my own back, I've got my own sides, I've got my own top, bottom, front, like I've got me. And I have other people who have me, and I have this incredible sentient world that has me. And all of that actually wants the best for me, which means I get to, I've started using the word self regard rather than self love. And because there's something about that, again, I think we misunderstand what love is a lot. And there's something about self regard that feels a little bit more like it's got some more roots to it, and like it's got a little bit more of that elite performer, like I'm holding my body and the life spark that it stewards as sacred. And if I were to really truly believe that it was worthy and sacred, you know how would I move through my day, and what kinds of support would I call in, and how would I feed it, and how would I take care of it, and what boundaries with work would I set, and and I think that's some of what we're talking about with those elite performers. And I think that's some of what, when people are in this acute pain, you know um or are in pain from being an elite performer that's doing it from that place of go 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 go, right? Like whatever the pain is that people have, that pain is inviting us back to self-regard so that we can actually tend ourselves and then become those actual, like, balanced, cared for elite performers, who are really like at the top of their game, whatever their game is,
Yeah.
because they've they've decided that they're worthy of all of that care and all of that support and all the things that it takes to be optimally alive and well.
That's a great place to stop. So
Mm-hmm.
my last question was going to be like, what's your personal definition of health? But I think you just stated that. And I don't even
Mm-hmm.
want to like, I'm not even going to like desecrate that. So, so thank you, Kate, for
Mm.
joining me in this conversation.
Thank you, Ruth. This was really fun, actually.
So awesome. I hope that we'll get to do it again. And for those
Yeah.
of you listening, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. I'll put Kate's website and all of her information in the description, and we'll catch you in the next episode. So thanks for joining
Amazing. Yeah. Thanks, Ruth. And thanks, foot nerders.
us.